and welcome to Neo Psychology of me, your teacher, Mr. Neo, the channel where I teach online psychology lessons for my wonderful students. Today we're carrying on with the Psychopathology unit. This is the penultimate lesson in the Psychopathology unit, lesson 11, the biological approach to explaining OCD. Let's rock and roll. The biological approach to explaining OCD. Think back to the approaches unit. What does the biological approach suggest about behavior? What would the biological approach suggest to be the reason behind OCD? Okay, how does the biological approach explain behavior? Okay, the behaviorist approach says you're born as a blank slate and then it's your experiences that make you who you are, whereas the biological approach doesn't believe that. The biological approach believes what? That what has a factor? Genes, genetics. Genetics define who you are, okay? So here we are in the Psychopathology unit, getting towards the end now. We had a look at definitions of abnormality, phobias, depression and OCD. We looked at the behavioural approach for explaining and treating phobias. We looked at the cognitive approach for explaining and treating depression. And today we're on the biological approach for explaining obsessive compulsive disorder, OCD. So there are two biological explanations for OCD, the genetic explanations and the neural explanations. Let's start with the genetic. Show comprehension and apply knowledge of genetic explanations of OCD. Learning objective 1. We now turn to the third mental disorder in the specification, OCD, and consider explanations for it. In particular, we are interested in how an individual's vulnerability to OCD may be affected by their genetic makeup and how the brain functioning of a sufferer of OCD may differ from that of someone without the condition. Genetic explanations of OCD. Now, some mental disorders appear to have a stronger biological component than others, and OCD is a good example of a condition that may be largely understood as biological in nature. One form of biological explanation is the genetic explanation. Genes are involved in individual vulnerability to OCD. Lewis in 1937 observed that of his OCD patients, 37% had parents with OCD and 21% had siblings with OCD. This suggests that OCD runs in families, although what is probably passed on from one generation to the next is genetic vulnerability, not the certainty of OCD. So, OCD is only common in around 1 to 2% of the population, okay? So it's not particularly common. It's not uncommon, to be fair, 2% quite high, but 1 to 2%. But if Lewis found that with his patients, there was a 37% concordance rate with parents and a 21% concordance rate with siblings, that shows there must be some sort of genetic factor here, because the fact that you share 50% of your genetics with your parents and 50% of your genetics with your siblings, there must be some sort of genetic component here, because you are clearly more prone to developing OCD with if your parent or your siblings have it than with someone general in the population. According to the diathesis stress model, certain genes leave some people more likely to suffer a mental disorder, but it is not certain. Some environmental stress experience is necessary to trigger the condition. So this is the diathesis stress model. What it's saying is, you have a genetic vulnerability, so a diathesis, to a certain mental disorder, in this case OCD. But it doesn't trigger the condition of OCD until an environmental stressor becomes apparent. And it's similar with schizophrenia. Again, you're born with your genes, and there are certain genes that make you more vulnerable to OCD or schizophrenia, but they don't necessarily become activated or become apparent until it is triggered by stressors. And there are lots of stressors in our everyday world. For example, sexual abuse is an environmental stressor, or physical abuse, or smoking weed, or doing drugs. Those are stressors. Those are things, they're experiences you can do in your life that activate these candidate genes and can make you develop OCD, okay? So the truth is you might not necessarily know that you have these, genes that make you vulnerable to OCD, and only once you develop them and you've triggered them does it become apparent. Right. Candidate genes. Researchers have identified genes which create vulnerability for OCD called candidate genes. Some of these genes are involved in regulating the development of serotonin system. For example, the gene 5-HT1D beta is implicated in the efficiency of transport of serotonin across synapses. And we're going to have a look a bit about that next lesson. So, genetic explanations. Genes make up what? They make up the chromosomes and consists of DNA, which codes the physical features of an organism, such as height and eye color, but also the psychological features, such as mental disorders and intelligence. Genes are transmitted from parent to offspring, i.e. they are inherited. Okay? So these are genetic explanations. What they suggest is OCD does have a genetic component. Right, so we got Jack. OCD is widely believed to be a biological condition with its roots in genetic vulnerability and brain dysfunction. Jack suffers from OCD. His grandfather and uncle also suffered from OCD, to the extent that his uncle had brain surgery to relieve his symptoms. As a psychology student, Jack is curious about what might have caused his condition. Now, what might his psychologist tell Jack about the likely role of genetic vulnerability in causing his OCD? 4 marks, okay? Give yourself 5 minutes. It's an application question. We're applying our knowledge to this scenario about Jack. In your answer, you can talk about Jack. Don't talk vaguely. Oh, one would find that this. No, Jack. Tell me about Jack. Tell me about Jack's granddad. Tell me about his scenario, okay? Quote parts of the question in your answer. That's the best way to get marks in an application question, okay? Give that a go. Give yourself 5 minutes. Pause the video because I'm going to go through the answer now. What might his psychologist tell Jack about the likely role of genetic vulnerability in causing his OCD? Now, Jack's psychologist might tell him that as there is OCD in his family, and as OCD is believed to be highly heritable, it is very likely that he has inherited a vulnerability to OCD. The psychologist might also tell Jack about diathesis stress, the idea that genetic makeup makes people vulnerable to conditions, but that some environmental trigger is also needed before the condition develops. Okay, so it's the diathesis stress model. Just because you find that you've got the genes that make you vulnerable to OCD, doesn't mean you automatically get OCD. It means you need to be careful to ensure that you don't trigger this OCD because you've got the diathesis, okay? You've got the vulnerability, but you need to ensure that you limit the stresses in your life so it doesn't develop in triggering the OCD, okay? She might tell him that there are a range of candidate genes, including those that regulate the development of the serotonin system. However, she might add that there are a range of possible genes involved and that OCD appears to be the result of a different combination of genes acting together. There is no one OCD gene. There's a collection of genes, okay? It's polygenic. And those are the genetic explanations of OCD. Identify one thing you learned about the genetic explanations. Why do you think learning about it is important? How does it apply in real life? Who is this information useful to? Okay? What questions has this raised for you? Okay. Lesson objective 1. Show comprehension and apply knowledge of genetic explanation of OCD. Done. We're moving on to learning objective 2. Show comprehension and apply knowledge of the neural explanations of OCD. So neural means brain, okay? Brain explanations, neural explanations. Okay, we just looked at the biological approach to explaining OCD, but now we're going to have a look into how an individual's vulnerability to OCD may be affected by their genetic makeup. In today's lesson, we're interested in how the brain's functioning of a sufferer of OCD may differ from that of someone without the condition. So neural explanations of OCD. The genes associated with OCD are likely to affect the levels of key neurotransmitters as well as structures of the brain. These are neural explanations. The role of serotonin. What's that on the right? Over here. It's the synapse. One explanation for OCD concerns the role of the neurotransmitter serotonin, which is believed to help regulate mood. Neurotransmitters are responsible for relaying information from one neuron to another. So in our brain, we've got millions and billions of neurons all connected together that make all these neural pathways that sends messages to each other to tell the brain to do different things. Okay? And one of those messages might be to create serotonin, for example, to help regulate mood. If a person has low levels of serotonin, then normal transmission of mood relevant information does not take place, and mood and sometimes other mental processes are affected. At least some cases of OCD may be explained by a reduction in the functioning of the serotonin system in the brain. So what's happening is, in your brain you've got all these neurons that send messages to each other, and one of the messages might be create serotonin. Now what they're finding is, if the message isn't going across correctly, across the neurons, across the synapse, then that results in low levels of serotonin. Now serotonin has been known to regulate mood, and those people that have low levels of serotonin may not be able to regulate their mood, and therefore may result in obsessive compulsive disorder symptoms. Those are the neural explanations. Fill in the gaps with me. Neural explanations is the view that physical and psychological characteristics are determined by the behavior of the nervous system, in particular the brain, as well as individual neurons. Okay. Quick bit, a little bit more information on this. So, decision-making symptoms. Some cases of OCD, and in particular hoarding disorder, which is a form of OCD, seem to be associated with impaired decision-making. This, in turn, may be associated with abnormal functioning of the lateral, which is the side bits of the frontal lobes of the brain. And the frontal lobes are the front parts of the brain, behind your forehead. Okay, so it's here. That are responsible for logical thinking and decision making. And if you think about it, people with OCD, they may not have logical thinking and they may be making bad decisions, okay? That might explain some of those obsessive thoughts that they have. So there may be dysfunction or abnormal functioning in the lateral frontal lobes. There is also evidence to suggest that an area called the left parahippocampal gyrus associated with processing unpleasant emotions functions abnormally in OCD as well. So if I was to summarize that, there are some cases of OCD that seem to be associated with abnormal functioning in the brain. Abnormal functioning of the lateral frontal lobes, which is associated with logical thinking and impaired decision making, and abnormal functioning of the left parahippocampal gyrus, which is associated with processing unpleasant emotions. People with OCD, they may have abnormal functioning of these specific parts of the brain, and you can see at what part they're associated with. Okay, again, we've got Jack. It's the same question. OCD is widely believed to be a biological condition with its roots in genetic vulnerability and brain dysfunction. Jack suffers from OCD. His grandfather and uncle also suffered from OCD to the extent that his uncle had brain surgery to relieve his symptoms. As a psychology student, Jack is curious about what might have caused his condition. Now, what might the psychologist say about what might be happening in his brain that is associated with his symptoms? Right? So we're looking at the neural explanation of OCD now, okay? How might the psychologist explain the neural explanations of OCD, okay? Give yourself 5 minutes, 4 marks. Give that a go now, please. Let's go through the answers. What might the psychologist say about what may be happening in his brain that is associated with his symptoms? Now, Jack's psychologist would probably tell him that although it is believed that there is a biological basis for OCD and that it is why his uncle had brain surgery, we do not fully understand how OCD operates on a neural level. she would probably tell him that the serotonin system in the brain is likely to be involved and that this is why his mood is affected, but that some people with OCD also seem to have problems with their lateral frontal lobes, which are involved in decision making, and the left parahippocampal gyrus. This difficulty in decision making may explain Jack's compulsive behavior. And that's learning objective 2, neural explanations for OCD. Let's move on to learning objective 3 now, okay? To discuss and evaluate the genetic and neural explanations of OCD. What are some of the strengths and limitations of the biological approach to explaining OCD? Right. Supporting evidence from twins. There is evidence from a variety of sources for the idea that some people are vulnerable to OCD as a result of their genetic makeup. One of the best sources of evidence for the importance of genes is twin studies. Nestad et al. In 2010 reviewed previous twin studies and found that 68% of identical twins shared OCD as opposed to 31% of non-identical twins. This strongly suggests a genetic influence on OCD. Okay, so we've got identical and non-identical twins here. Identical twins are called monozygotic and non-identical twins are called dizygotic. All it means is this, okay? If you are a non-identical twin, what it means is your mother produced 2 eggs, okay, 2 single eggs, and 2 separate sperms fertilize those eggs, okay? Dizygotic, non-identical twins share 50% of their genes like normal brothers and sisters. Now, with identical twins or monozygotic twins, there's 1 egg, okay, and 1 sperm fertilized that 1 egg. Now what happens is the egg splits into 2. So you've got 2 eggs now with 2 sperms, right? But it's the exact same egg and the exact same sperm. So you've got 2 fertilized zygotes now, monozygotic, okay? And they got 100% the same genetic material, okay? 100% identical. So we got monozygotic identical and dizygotic non-identical. Now, the fact that the monozygotic twins, the identical twins, had a 68% concordance. When one twin got OCD, there was a 68% chance that the other twin would have OCD as well. 68%, that's very high. Now what that tells us is that there is definitely a genetic component in OCD. However, it shows us that it can't only be genetic. If it was only genetic, it should be 100% concordance because they share their genes 100%. But it's not 100%, it's 68%. So it shows us there is definitely a genetic component, but it's not purely genetic. There must be other processes going on because it's not 100%. So this is when we think about this diathesis stress model, right? You may have the same vulnerability to the OCD, the diathesis, but maybe you haven't encountered the same environmental stresses that activates the OCD. And that's an interactionist approach. So there is supporting evidence from twins. However, you could use it as a limitation and say, however, on the other hand, the fact that it's not 100% shows that it's not purely genetic. Twin studies are flawed as genetic evidence as well. So twin studies are a standard source of evidence for genetic influence, as we just saw of the last example in Nestad. However, they make the assumption that identical twins are only more similar than non-identical twins in terms of their genes, but overlook the fact that identical twins may also be more similar in terms of shared environments. For example, non-identical twins might be a boy and a girl who have quite different experiences. So what this is saying is this. We've got this nature and nurture debate going on, okay? Nature is to do with your genetics, all right? Nurture is to do with your environment. Now, what it's saying is this. With the example of the monozygotic twins, and they shared 68% concordance, what they're saying is, well, yes, it could be because they share 100% of their genetics, but they also share their experiences. They also share a similar life. They're likely to have worn similar clothes. They're likely to have gone to the same school, had the same upbringing, been in the same class, okay? Done all these things because they're identical twins, okay? So identical twins have a similar life experiences, more so than non-identical twins. So it's difficult to separate the nature from the nurture. So twin studies are flawed as genetic evidence. The final evaluative point is that there is supporting evidence from drugs. There is evidence to support the role of some neural mechanisms in OCD. So, for example, some antidepressants work purely on the serotonin system, increasing the level of the neurotransmitter. People with OCD have low levels of serotonin, and if you take antidepressants, it heightens your levels of serotonin. Such drugs are effective in reducing the OCD symptoms. Okay? These drugs, they help. So this suggests that the serotonin system is involved in OCD, which supports this neural explanation of OCD. This is a strength. Okay. Can you summarize each of those evaluative points into exactly 10 words? Thinking hard. And as a challenge, can you think of any of your own criticisms? Can you think of any of your own using Grave and Scout? Okay, Grave and Scout, have a look in the booklet for Grave and Scout. Okay, and that's the evaluation. To be able to discuss and evaluate genetic explanations of OCD and neural explanations of OCD, learning objective 3, we're done. We are moving on to the plenary. What have we got? Oh, it is research methods. Here we go. Lewis in 1936 assessed 50 patients with OCD at the Maudsley Hospital in London, looking for co-occurrence of OCD in immediate family. He found that 37% of his patients with OCD had parents with OCD and 21% had siblings with OCD. This suggests that there may be a genetic basis to OCD. Right. 3 questions. Number 1, explain why this study might be considered to be a quasi-experiment. Number 2, you plan to carry out a similar study on patients with OCD and their siblings. You have access to a list of all patients with OCD in your nearest city. Describe how you would obtain a random sample of participants. And then question 3, describe how you would obtain a stratified sample. Strata might include gender, age, and socioeconomic status. 3 questions. Give those a go now, please, okay? And I'm going to answer them. Here we go. Explain why this study might be considered a quasi. Now, there are 4 types of experiments, okay? We've got lab, field, natural, and quasi. Why is this one quasi? The study could be considered a quasi-experiment because there is an independent variable, genetic similarity, and a dependent variable, the probability of having OCD. However, the independent variable is naturally occurring difference rather than a variable that has been changed by natural conditions. Therefore, it is a quasi-experiment rather than natural experiment, okay? You can't go, you be in the, right, you can't have a bunch of participants come in and go, okay, you guys are going to be in the OCD group and you guys are going to be in the non-OCD group. You've either got OCD or you haven't, all right? It's naturally occurring. And you can't make someone have OCD, right? So OCD, having OCD or having the genetic vulnerability to OCD makes it a quasi-experiment. You plan to carry out a similar study on patients with OCD and their siblings. You have access to a list of all patients with OCD in your nearest city. Describe how you would obtain a random sample of participants. This is commonly a 3 to 4 mark question, right? Explain how you do a random sample, okay? First of all, you need to get a list of all the people in your target population, all right? It says you've got that in the example. 2, assign each participant with OCD in the city a number. 3, use a random number generator to produce a certain amount of numbers. And then you do that until you fit the number of participants you need. Generate random numbers using an appropriate computer program. And then last question, question 3. Describe how you would obtain a stratified sample. Remember, stratified comes from the word strata, meaning subgroups, so different subgroups. To obtain a stratified sample, you first of all need to identify your target populations, which is patients with OCD in the UK. You then need to work out what proportion of OCD patients belong to certain age groups and gender and other relevant variables in your population. So, for example, if you knew that 60% of patients with OCD are women, then 60% of your sample should be women. If your sample size was going to be 100, then there should be 60 females. You would then randomly select 60 female patients from your target sample. Okay? And this can be done with gender, it can be done with age, it could be done with race, it could be done with social economic background. And that was today's lesson. That was lesson 10, the biological approach to explaining OCD. Next lesson is our last lesson on this unit, psychopathology. It's going to be lesson 11, the biological approach to treating OCD. There we go. Well done, my neo-psychologists. Great work today. I've been Mr. Neo. Keep up the good work. God bless and peace.
I'm feeling like Will, I feel like a prince, I'm feeling myself. I'm loaded with bills, cause I wasn't blessed with no Uncle Phil. Don't know how it feels, I wanted to flex, they told me to chill. I'm making a flip, my life is a flick, now load up the film.